Welcome back. What was going on there? And should we be targeting net zero or absolute zero emissions? Don't worry, we'll get back to those. But first, we need to return to the defining question of this 9-part series. How much will it cost to stop climate change? Well, how about we answer that the easy way? Many online sources show this figure, 1 to 1.5% of global GDP in annual investment until 2050. That translates to approximately $40 trillion in total. So why is that so much lower than the 216 trillion I referenced in the first video? The statistic comes from a 2020 report by the Energy Transitions Commission, a group formed by 40 large oil companies, banks, and industrial brands. Without wanting to point any fingers, I think it's worth referencing some other sources as well. The International Energy Agency's May 2021 report seems more reasonable, estimating around 150 trillion, and that excludes non-energy related sources like agriculture and waste. But despite other sources, many people still think that decarbonisation will require only 1% of global income per year in investment, less than a fifth of the IEA's estimate. So how can they have ended up at this value? Many estimates use the marginal abatement cost method, multiplying the average cost of removing 1 tonne of carbon dioxide or equivalents from the atmosphere by the number of tonnes which we need to remove to stop the Earth warming. You may have come across marginal abatement curves. They usually look like this, with some negative bars because future savings are deducted from costs. The negative ones would be good investments, and the positive ones need to be subsidised. But we're not interested in that. Don't worry, we'll come back to green technologies as investments. For now, we just want to see the total upfront bill for decarbonisation. And for that we need to look at gross abatement costs. We're also going to focus on annual abatement rather than project lifetime abatement. This way is easier to compare with current annual emissions, and it better reflects the urgency of the problem. After making these adjustments, I've created a gross marginal abatement cost curve using data from the World Resources Institute and the UK's Climate Change Committee. Now we can plot the average gross abatement cost based on a $40 trillion total cost estimate, which comes to $817 per tonne. It's clear that this is too low to be achievable across all sectors. I suspect that some studies assume we only need to decarbonise the cheaper sectors, and that we can offset the rest using carbon capture and storage. Let's add another line to show the gross marginal abatement cost of CCS, which I calculate to be $811. This supports my theory because it's very close to the average cost from the 40 trillion estimate. But what's wrong with offsetting? Isn't getting to net zero this way just as good as getting to absolute zero emissions? Donating £100 a year to CCS or forestry projects could cover the emissions from ownership of one small car in the UK. Well, firstly, there are other forms of air pollution from burning fossil fuels, and they can be more harmful in the short term. Net zero wouldn't solve this problem. And then there's financial responsibility. You already buy gas for your boiler and petrol for your car. Are you going to pay even more every year to offset these emissions? Or would you rather invest a larger amount upfront in a heat pump and an electric car? Both of these will eventually pay for themselves in fuel savings. But most importantly, with a growing population requiring more and more agricultural land, there's only so much offsetting we can do through forestry. So most of us will have to rely on CCS technologies. And here's where I explain my strange introduction. Emitting CO2 and then sucking it back up again is like drinking loads of wine to treat your coffee jitters. Fossil fuels are like coffee, energising us but also causing side effects. CCS is like alcohol, acting as a downer to counter these side effects. But now that causes its own side effects. We can think of them as the hangover of unnecessary energy intensity and increased raw material extraction. Any form of carbon sequestration will use up land, and the high-tech methods also consume electricity and heat. These in turn will need to be renewable, and the additional infrastructure required will cause more lithium and more rare earth metals to be mined. I probably don't need to tell you that these are both related to humanitarian and biodiversity issues. So let's take the healthier route instead. Renewable power for the planet and a refreshing glass of water for me. I'm convinced that simpler is better, even if it's more expensive. Otherwise we could end up in a spiral of dealing with unintended consequences. Our long-term goal should be to renewably generate only the energy we need and then to use it efficiently. Absolute zero.